Brought to you by the Asombro Institute for Science Education.
Hi, I'm Tim Wright. I'm a professor in biology at New Mexico State University. And so my job consists of teaching classes about evolution and animal behavior. And also I am a researcher, so I investigate vocal learning in birds with a particular interest in parrots. Well, that's a great question. There are so many reasons why I love studying birds. I think birds are very important parts of the ecosystem, so they do very important things for the plants and animals that they live with, like pollinate and spread seeds around. But they're also beautiful. Anyone who's watched birds for a while is just struck with the beauty of the feathers and the movement of birds and their ability to fly. But there's one thing in particular that I like about parrots, and that's why I study them, which is their ability to learn vocalizations. So it's something that they share with humans, and so by studying what parrots do with their vocal learning abilities, we can understand a little bit better what we humans do when we learn our own languages. Some species of birds migrate and some don't. And it's a really interesting question about how migration has evolved in the first place. And it does seem to be that not migrating is what we would call ancestral. So that species initially, most species did not migrate. And many of those species lived in the tropics where conditions were roughly stable and the same throughout the year. And so there was lots of food all through the year, but there was also lots of competition for that food. And so what we think happened was that some individuals of some species started moving away during times of high competition, and they moved farther and farther away. And when they did, they found new food types and new opportunities for food, especially when they moved far north from the tropics into temperate regions. And during our temperate spring and summer, there's all sorts of bugs hatching out and all sorts of fruits and berries coming out on trees. And so lots and lots of food that was available in these temperate regions that wasn't available in the tropical regions. So we think that any individual or any species that is migrating has to think about two things. They have to balance the benefits of migrating, so finding new areas with less competition, new food sources especially, but maybe new areas to breed in. And they have to balance that against the substantial costs of migrating. So the costs of energetically moving themselves over hundreds or thousands of miles from their wintering grounds to their summering grounds, the costs of having to evolve and maintain navigation systems, so individuals have to be able to find their way from one place to another, and the costs of failure. Sometimes migration goes astray, migrants go astray, and so some of them will sometimes die during these very long journeys. How birds navigate is a really interesting question, and it's one that has been studied by people who study animal behavior like me, although I should say that personally I have not studied it, so I'm not a real expert, but I've certainly read a lot about it in becoming an animal behaviorist. And people have been studying it for over 50 years, trying to understand how it is birds migrate. And the answers are still coming. We're still learning about it. There seem to be, in many species, multiple systems in which species use to navigate. So anybody who has to get from one place to another place needs two things. They need a map, and then they need a compass to tell them which direction they're moving in. And so the maps sometimes seem to be based on memory. Individuals have traveled the migration route. Perhaps they followed somebody who knew it the first time, and after that they knew it and remembered it. Sometimes they seem to be instinctual. That is, that they understand roughly what areas or what cues to move towards. The navigation or the compass system is even more interesting. Some birds seem to use the stars as a compass, as a direction to know which direction is north and which is south. Some use the sun, and some use magnetoreception. So this is an interesting sensory system that we humans don't really use. Turns out, and I'll come back to this in a bit, that we may actually have it, even though we don't know it or don't use it. But birds seem to have developed it quite well. And so they use the Earth's magnetic field, which changes in direction and strength from the poles down to the tropics. And they can use that to know when they're flying north or when they're flying south. So right now, it is thought there's actually a disagreement among scientists in exactly how birds sense this magnetic field, how they go about their magnetoreception. One group thinks that it's comes down to cells that may be located near the top of the bird's bills that have a mineral in it called magnetite that is sensitive to magnetic field. And so the birds basically are able to point their bill in the right direction and sense the magnetic field. More recently, people have started to think that maybe there's something actually in the eye that can sense the magnetic field. It's a particular protein called a cryptochrome, and it's light sensitive, but when it absorbs light, it also can sense the magnetic fields. And honestly, I don't really quite understand how it works. But the interesting thing about it, not just that birds may be sensing this magnetic field with their eyes, but is that we humans also have cryptochromes in our own retinal cells, so in our own eyes. We have the same chemical. And people are quite interested in trying to figure out whether maybe people actually can sense magnetic fields using that. One experiment they did was to take the human form of this protein and put it into fruit flies, which have their own cryptochrome and are able to sense magnetoreception, sense magnetic fields with it. And when they put in the human form of that gene into these fruit flies, they actually found the fruit flies could still navigate. So that's an interesting suggestion that maybe the human form of this cryptochrome actually could help us with navigating. So there are a couple different experiments that scientists have done in order to try to understand better how this magnetoreception may be working in birds. And so scientists who thought that it might be located in the bills did a couple different interesting experiments to try to judge what was going on. One thing that they did was they actually went in and cut some nerves within the bird's bills that led from this area of cells that they thought had the magnetoreception into the brain. And then you need a control for any experiment. So for the control, in a second group of birds, they cut a different nerve that led from that part of the bill back, but one that was just used for olfaction. And when they did that, they found that the birds who had their olfactory nerve severed were still able to sense a magnetic field. And they actually did this not allowing them free flying, but within the confines of a small cage. And birds that could sense that field pecked a particular key to show that they could sense it. Whereas birds that had it's called the trigeminal nerve cut that led to this area of cells that was the supposed source of the magnetoreception, those birds were no longer able to sense the field correctly. And so that was an indication that maybe this part of the bill with its magnetite loaded cells was important for magnetoreception. Then there's a set of experiments that they did with free-flying birds, and in this case they used homing pigeons. Homing pigeons are a really neat breed of pigeons that are capable, if you take them away from their home coop and move them even 100 miles, they're able to find their way back home and fly back. And it was thought that perhaps they did this with magnetoreception, and so one way they tested that was to put small magnets on the heads of the birds, of some birds, and again, they had some birds who had a heavy weight on their head, but that wasn't magnetic, so just a brass piece of metal. And they allowed both those sets of birds to try to fly home. The ones who had the brass, the control, they were able to fly home, whereas the ones that had the magnet on their head had a much harder time, and many of them didn't make it back to their coop. So that was nice evidence that indeed these pigeons were using magnetoreception, although in that case, they didn't get quite down to the level of figuring out where it was. So there are not very many parrots living locally, although historically there were parrots that just came up over the southern border into the boot heel of New Mexico, a species called the thick-billed parrot. But now they mostly live in Mexico in the high mountains of the Sierra Madre. But vocal learning is not just in parrots, it's also in many of the songbirds that are quite common around here. And then hummingbirds also are capable of learning vocalizations. But many birds don't, so lots of other birds like ducks and the roadrunners that we see around here, they don't learn their vocalizations, they just develop them innately. I have done some work with hummingbirds in Costa Rica. So with a student of mine who was from Costa Rica, we did a long-term project studying a species there called the long-billed hermit. And in that species, they have a very interesting social system where males hold very small territories in clumps. So there'll be many males within, say, 3 or 4 males within a classroom, your classroom at school. And there they display for many hours a day in hopes of attracting a female to mate with. And those males, we do know, learn their vocalizations. They have a very simple song, but that song is learned, and several males on one of these groups, or what we call a lek of a group of the territories, will share the same song, and that lek song will be different from neighboring leks or leks farther afield. But interestingly, those songs will change over time. So what is a hot or attractive song for males to be singing in one year will change over time, and in a few years down the road, the males there will be singing a different song. And it's pretty clear that that song changes through what we call cultural evolution. So much as your parents may use words that you guys don't use because you're trading around new words, the young male long-billed hermits will learn new songs and trade them among themselves, and they'll be different than